Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I am super excited to share with all of you demos and my initial review of the Pat McGrath Celestial Nirvana Mothership Mega Palette. So I know this video is coming up super late. I feel like everyone has already filmed their videos on this palette, but for some reason, even though I bought this on launch day from Pat McGrath's website, it just took an incredibly long time to arrive. But I am very excited that it is finally here, and I'm so excited to play around with this palette. So let's first talk about the packaging. This is what the outside box looks like. And feel free to pause here if you want to look at the ingredients list. So inside the box, the palette itself basically looks the exact same. So you have that same sort of pattern. It's basically the pink version of last year's palette with slightly different motifs. You have more of a heart motif instead of the crown from last year. And the size of the palette is a little bit different. So you can see here that it's a little bit shorter than last year's, but a little bit wider. Compared to the year before that, it's basically the same height, but much thicker. On the back, you have all of the shade names. And this palette has an 18-month shelf life and is made in Italy. So now let's open up this gorgeous palette. Oh my gosh, it's so pretty. Okay, let me give you guys a close-up. So here we have the palette in all of its glory. I am so excited to use all of these shades. So there are 18 shadows in here, and it can feel a little bit overwhelming when you first look at it. But this is actually divided up into 3 separate color stories. So these 2 columns here are a neutral color story. And then you have a cool color story with the 2 columns in the center. And then on this side, you have 2 columns for a warm color story. Of course, you can mix and match these however you see fit, but I am glad that she grouped these in these different color stories because I think that just makes it a lot more approachable given that this is quite a colorful palette. Comparing this year's palette with last year's, you can see that this year's is a lot more colorful and last year's was a lot more warm toned. The year before had a little bit more of a grungy intergalactic vibe with a lot more purple leaning tones. So now let's get into the swatches. I'm going to swatch these from top to bottom, left to right, just so we can keep the 3 sets of color stories together. So here we have the first 3 shades, starting with the deep brown shade. This is a pretty cool brown. Then we have the super creamy, flaky bronze shade, which is so liquidy. Wow, I am really excited to get this on the lids. And then we have this matte forest green shade, which I'm so excited about because we've never had a green matte from Pat McGrath, but she has some really beautiful green shimmers. Here are the next 3 shades, starting with a highlight shade, which is kind of the skin show shade in this collection. This has a slight peachiness to it. And then we have a beautiful transition shade. So I think this will look gorgeous with any everyday look. And then we have this gold shade that has a little bit of grunginess to it that I think will pair really well with the rest of this color story. So here is the first 6 swatched in that neutral color story. Basically, I think if you want to remove this green shade and this gold shade, you'll have a really beautiful basic quad that can be used on an everyday basis. And if you want a little bit more color, adding these 2 is a really great way to amp up the look. Now let's go into the cool color story, which is the one I'm most excited about. So we have this beautiful navy matte. I'm super excited about this. I feel like it'll be so nice for a wide variety of purpley looks. And then we have this rose gold pink metallic, which is very creamy. And this really bright purple shade. So this is much more bright than pretty much any matte I've ever seen from Pat McGrath. So I think that'll be a real show-stopping shade. Now these mattes are a little bit on the drier side, which is common for this kind of slightly harder to formulate color, but it'll be interesting to see how these perform on the lids. Here are the next 3 cool shades. We have this icy lavender shade, which is in her Skin Show formula, but has a really nice, unique coolness to it. And then we have this really bright, mid-toned pinky fuchsia purple. So that looks like a lot of fun. And then I'm so excited for this blue. Wow, look at that. So this blue is kind of in a similar formulation to the lavender Skin Show shade and the Skin Show shade up here too. So a little more of a satin shimmer in comparison to these over here, which are really, really flaky. But I think this will look so gorgeous all over the lid. Now let's get into these warm tones. So first we have the deepest shade, which is sort of a terracotta matte. Then we have this very metallic bronzy shade, and then this pretty pink matte. And here we have the last three warm shades. So I'm running out of real estate, but let me see if I can fit all of these. So first we have this sort of satin gold shade. Then we have this really hot red coral matte shade. And then finally, we have this beautiful metallic orange, which is so smooth. Just look at how far that glided. And here is a close-up of all the shades. So we start with this neutral color story, and then we have this cool toned color story, and then we have a warm color story at the end. On the whole, the mattes were a tad bit dry, which is common for Pat McGrath's matte formula, and the shimmers were all very creamy. So all of these feel very in line with Pat McGrath's existing formulations. And in case you're curious, in the smaller eyeshadow palettes that she released with this holiday collection, there is a new matte formula that's sort of a velvet matte. So that's different from the ones in this. This palette contains the standard matte formula and standard shimmer formula from Pat McGrath. In terms of putting together looks from this palette, one thing I do want to point out is basically each of these sets of 6 has the same formula in terms of they all have 3 mattes to them. One deeper matte, one lighter matte, and one mid-tone matte. And then they each have 2 shimmers that are a little bit more on the satin side. So that's these 2, and these 2. And then they have one shimmer that is much more flaky and high shine metallic. And so that's this, and this. So hopefully that's helpful in terms of breaking down these formulas as you're going in and trying to create new looks. So without further ado, let me pull you guys in and let's start demoing these shadows. So first off, I want to show you guys how this quad up here would look, just because I think that's probably one that many of you would be interested in for a very everyday look. And so I'm going to start out with my Refer number 27 brush on this eye with the lighter matte shade, since I think this will be a beautiful transition shade. And this is blending out very easily. It actually has a little bit more pigmentation than I would have anticipated given how light it looks in pan. But you can also definitely blend this out nicely. So as you can see on my skin tone, this is a very nice natural transition shade. Basically just kind of looks like a shadow. Now to add some depth, I'm going into this deeper matte shade. And using my Refer number 14 brush, I'm going to concentrate this closer to the lash line area on the outer corner. And then all over the lid, I'm going into this shimmer. And this is honestly one of the shades that I think is most beautiful in the whole palette. It's a very multi-dimensional shimmer. If you look very close up, you can see all sorts of different coppery, silvery, golden shimmer particles in it. So even if it just kind of looks brown in pan, as you can see, it's really, really beautiful on the lids. And now with my mini booster, I'm going into this Skin Show shade. And I'm going to sweep that on the inner corner and inner third to add some light. And then also on the brow bone area. If you have one of her older palettes, she has in recent palettes made her Skin Show shades a bit more high impact, so that if you do want to use this all over the lid, kind of in place of where I put this metallic, it's really beautiful for that purpose too. You don't have to just use it for highlight. But as you can see, that just gives a really pretty everyday glam look. So if you are intimidated by all of the color in this palette, I will say this quad is probably going to be your best friend. Of course, it's not worth picking up this $82 palette just for this quad, but I wanted to show you guys this just to give you some options in terms of a much more subtle everyday look. Now, I do want to play with some color though, so now I'm going to go into this teal shade, and I have this on my Wayne Goss number 19 brush, and wow, okay, that actually built up very easily. I was just about to say we're gonna see how well this builds on top of that shade, but even on a really fluffy brush, I'm getting very nice pigment payoff. Okay, nice. Okay, that's really good because I was a little bit worried given how the swatches were a little bit patchy, but on the lids, this is building very nicely. Little bit definitely goes a long way, so you should be a bit careful with your pigment placement to make sure it's not going anywhere you don't want it to go. But wow, look at that. So that just totally changed this look to be a bit more interesting. Definitely did get a little bit of fallout though, so I would say with these more colorful shades, it might be good to first do your eye makeup. But wow, that's actually really pretty. I love this shade too. It's very vibrant, but also something that I think you could make work for a much more muted look as well. That's the nice thing about greens. They can kind of double as neutrals. Ooh. Okay, so there we have that green shade all over the outer portion of the lid. And now I'm gonna go in with this shade, and I'm going to kind of cover up that brown that I put earlier. And basically put this on the center of the lid because I want to see how well this builds. And wow, yeah, this has good opacity. I feel like it completely covered up that taupey brown. I mean, I do really like that taupey brown, so it's a little sad that it's gone. So now I'm going to go on the lower lash line, and with my rougher number 26, take a little bit of that green shade and just sweep that all along. Then with my Sonia G Builder, I'm going into this golden shade and running that right along there as well. Alrighty, so here we have the greenish gold look. So I think you can definitely actually create two very dissimilar looks from this first set of 6. I feel like these two kind of go together and these 4 go together. Basically, we went from very neutral to kind of St. Patrick's Day party. Now on the other eye, I'm gonna go into these warm shades. So I'm gonna start with my rougher number 16. And I'm gonna go into this really bright pink shade over here. And I'm gonna put this kind of on the inner half of my crease area. Wow, that's a really fun kind of bubblegum pink shade. And it does pack a nice pigment punch, which is good. So I cleaned off the excess. I'm going into this bright coral shade now. And I'm gonna put this on the outer half of that eye area. And this one comes across much more red on my eyes, although less bright coral and neon than it looks in pan. These do blend very easily though, which is great. Now to deepen that up, I'm going into that terracotta shade, and again concentrating that on the outer portion of my lid near the lash line. This shade is not the deepest, so if you really want some depth, you might need to go back in with the brown matte from earlier, but this is a really beautiful, rich tone. So now for the shimmers, I'm first going to take a little bit of this shade and concentrate this on the inner portion of the lid. There we go. That's a really pretty kind of penny copper shade. In certain light, this looks very similar to this terracotta shade, and in other light, it looks much more orangey copper. Then I'm gonna go into this shade over here and brush this all over the center of my lid, since this is the most shiny and reflective. This is much more of a yellowy, bronzy gold. I actually expected, based on how this formulation looks in pan, that it would be a little bit more flaky on the lids, but you can see it's overall a pretty smooth metallic shade. In pan, it just has that sort of chunky appearance. And then cleaning off my mini booster, I'm going into this shade over here. And I'm gonna use this on the inner corner. So you can see that's a pretty gold highlighting shade. Also gonna take a little bit of that on the brow bone area. So I went off camera to quickly finish off this look. I basically replicated on the bottom what I did on the top. So here we have the completed warm toned look next to the completed technically neutral but now green and yellow look. What do you guys think? I think both of these looks are quite beautiful, and I'm actually kind of surprised how much I like this warm tone side. I feel like recently these sorts of really fiery looks have been a little bit less popular. People have been really into more cool toned, mauvey looks, but I think warm tones are starting to make a comeback, and this is a really pretty kind of fiery look. I'll also just say that I am very impressed with the quality of these shadows so far. A lot of these matte shades are a bit harder to formulate because these ones over here have that sort of bright neon quality to them. And then this one over here is that really cool toned kind of green. So often I do find these types of shadows to be a little bit patchy or hard to build up to opacity, but as you could see on both sides of my eyes, it's looking really good, and I really did not have to do much in terms of trying to blend these out or build them up. So for me, it's definitely been that same really effortless Pat McGrath experience, but with much more unique shades. So I am very excited with how this has come out so far. So I really liked both of those looks, and it was honestly pretty sad to take them off. But here I am back with some fresh primer and concealer around my eyes. And since this look is going to be cool toned, I added some cool toned blush and also switched out my Pat McGrath lip gloss. So here we are for the fourth and final look of the day. So for this look, I'm going to first start with this lighter purpley shade. And I'm going to put this just kind of on the inner portion of my crease area. And I'm going to do this on both eyes this time since I want a symmetrical final look. This shade, similar to the coral shade, comes across as less fuchsia on the lids than it did in pan or in swatch. Still very beautiful though. Switching out that brush now, I'm going into this purple shade, which is much more cool toned, and I'm going to put this on the outer portion of my transition area. So this way you guys can also see the difference between those two purples. One has more of a pinkiness to it, whereas the other one has more blue. So since I'm using this shade as a transition shade, it is taking me a little bit more time to blend out, but overall I think it's working quite well. Now to deepen things up, I'm going into this navy shade, and I'm going to use this on the outer portion. That's a really pretty shade. And I'm especially excited about this shade because I feel like it's pretty hard to get good navies. And so oftentimes when you're doing a cool toned look, you just have to go in with a black matte. But I feel like having a navy in your collection can really add some additional versatility. And so far this is going on very nicely. You can definitely see how it's distinct from that purple tone. It almost has a little bit of teal green in it as well. Very pretty. Aren't these just such fun colors on the lids? I'm so excited. And I feel like this also matches super well with the dress that I have on today. So already I'm so stoked about this look. All right, so now we have a lot of different options when it comes to shimmers. So I'm gonna first go into this blue because this is the shimmer I'm most excited about. And I'm going to put this kind of all over most of the lid. It's a little bit sheer, but I think I can build this up. Maybe this is actually a little bit better with a finger. Let me try that. Oh yeah, okay. Definitely apply this with a finger. You get way more pickup. Wow, so pretty. Oh my gosh, I just want to put this all over the lid, but we still have two other shimmers, so I'm gonna try to keep this a little bit closer to the center. But this is so pretty, and you can see in the areas where it's a little bit more sheared out, it's almost like it's adding a beautiful flip on top of those mattes. Wow, so much fun. So with the other side of that brush, I'm going to go into this rose gold shade. This one is a bit more flaky, and so I'm going to put this on the inner thirds. See how that goes together. Again, kind of applying sheer. I would say with the metallics and shimmers in this palette, it's probably best to go in with a finger if you want really good payoff. Let me actually try that. So I'm going to go in with a finger. Yeah, okay, you can see instantly with a finger that just adds so much more oomph. These are just very creamy shadows, and so I feel like the finger just picks them up a little bit better. You get more of a thick layer than you do with a brush. Of course, if you want that sort of sheer look, then a brush will give it to you. But personally, I'm going in for the opacity. And now with my mini booster, I'm going into that lavender shade, and I'm going to put this on the inner corners. That's really pretty. And also along the brow bone. I think it's so fun having this sort of lavender skin show shade, because her skin show shades also tend to run a little bit warm. Like the most she'll do is kind of like an icy platinum skin show shade, but this is the only one that is truly cool. Now for the lower lash line, I'm gonna mimic way down the top and start with this shade. I have this on a Sonia G detail brush, and I'm gonna run this along the inner half of that lower lash line area. Then I'm gonna go in with that cooler toned purple on the outer half. And then just with the tip, I'm going in with that navy shade just to deepen that up. And now I'm taking some of that sparkly blue, running that along the center, and then finishing off with a little bit of rose gold in the inner corners. So here we have the final look. What do you guys think? So I am a big fan of this look. I think it's so much fun. It gives me those fairy intergalactic vibes. It's just so colorful and beautiful, and something that I haven't been able to create with Pat McGrath shadows in the past. So I am so excited about these cool tone shades in particular. I think it just adds so much versatility to your Pat McGrath collection. I can already see just so many more looks that I can do with this palette, and also pairing this with my Pat McGrath Mothership palettes. For example, I think you could pair these purpley mattes along with Utopian Dream. Like imagine these sorts of mattes with one of these shades. I think that would be just incredibly, incredibly fun. Like look at those. This one in particular just has all of the shades of this look in just one eyeshadow. Also, if we dip into Subliminal, I think there's some really beautiful shades that can also go with these cool tones. So you have this Blitz Blue shade over here, and then this beautiful Astral shade. So I think these could also be a beautiful pairing. Like imagine this Blitz Blue with that navy shade, and then you could also put this over it as a topper. That would be a super fun look. And then Pat McGrath does have a bunch of greens as well in her shimmers, so I think you could use this green with a lot of her other palettes. For example, in Midnight Sun, we have this beautiful mossy green shade. This is such a gorgeous, everyday friendly, neutral green shade. And then we also have this blue violet shade over here, which I also think would be great with more of the cool toned shadows. I mean, look at that. These three with that navy would be so beautiful. And then if I go into Subversive, there are so many fun shades that you could pair with this palette. So again, we have a beautiful green shade. This is a little bit more of a golden green. And then you have these two shades, which would go so well with the blue. You have this sort of really deep, almost kind of blackened shimmer. And then you have this shade over here, which has a blue to purple flip to it. And then you have this purpley shade over here, which would be gorgeous as well with those purple mattes. And then if we go into Sublime, we have this Blitz Emerald shade. This one would be perfect with that cooler toned teal shade. So this is just some inspo for you guys, but if you have any of these Pat McGrath Motherships that have some of these more colorful, shimmery shades, I think these will all look so beautiful paired with the mattes in this new Mothership Mega palette. So on the whole, I am super, super excited about this palette. I feel like all of the shades performed impeccably on the lids today. Even these harder to formulate matte shades just blended out so easily, but were also really pigmented and buildable. And so I really loved all of the looks that I created today. And I'm just so excited that Pat McGrath finally listened to those of us who have been clamoring for some slightly different color stories, because for a while, basically ever since she came out with Divine Rose 1, she's mainly been doing a lot of kind of coral, plummy, rosy, peachy sorts of mattes and shimmers, and so this really broke out of the box, and there's something for everyone in this palette. If you're going for a super neutral look, you have one of the most beautiful neutral quads that I've seen from Pat McGrath. And then if you like more warm tones, you have this section, cool tones, this section, and then also a wide variety of different types of formulas if you want something more sparkly or something more satin or matte. So I really love this curation. I think it's just such a fun palette to have to round out any Pat McGrath collection. I also think for me personally, I will get a lot of use out of this because for context, at the moment, typically when I'm doing more colorful looks, and if I'm using any of these shades from Pat McGrath, I will often dip into my Natasha Denona palettes for some colorful mattes. And so for example, I have this pastel palette for any lighter shades of mattes, Circo Loco for more saturated, kind of cooler toned mattes, and then Trio Chrome for slightly more grungy but colorful mattes. So I get a lot of use from these three palettes from Natasha Denona simply because I find that most other brands don't really come out with so many colorful mattes. And so I'm super excited that now my favorite brand, Pat McGrath, has these available. And so I can also pair these with my indie shadows, which are all really colorful. And I love just going in with some mattes and just one multi-chrome shade all over the lids. So if you have similar makeup taste to me and you really like colorful, smoky eye looks, then I think this palette is perfect either by itself or in conjunction with your existing collection. Now, of course, I don't think this palette is for everyone. If you don't like colorful eye looks, then steer clear from this. I mean, there's way more affordable ways to get a quad that looks like this rather than picking up this palette. In general, I think last year's holiday palette is much more appropriate for those folks who do like to stick more with neutral looks, because in this palette, if you remove these shades, you're basically left with an extremely neutral color story. This year's palette's basically the opposite of that. If you remove this quad, everything is super colorful. And so this is definitely catering to a very different audience than last year. But I think that's great. I'm glad that Pat McGrath is mixing it up. And I really hope that she includes some of these more colorful matte shades in future motherships. So that's it for today's video. I would love to hear in the comments down below what you guys think about this palette. Will you be picking it up or anything else from this holiday release from Pat McGrath? One thing I will note is in my initial video where I went over her entire holiday release, I mentioned that I was going to pick up one of her cheek palettes, and I've since decided against that because I realized the one that I wanted to pick up has one shade I already have and another shade that I had but then returned because I didn't like it. And so it's not really worth it to me to pay $60 and get two shades that I either already have or don't like. So I did just want to make a quick note of that in case you're waiting for that video. I'm not actually planning on picking up any of her cheek palettes anymore. This is basically the only thing I think I'll pick up from her holiday release, at least until it goes on sale. If you guys have picked up anything from her holiday collection though, I would love to hear what your thoughts have been about it, since I definitely do have some FOMO. But thank you all so much for joining me today, and if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!